Okay.
Okay. First of all, thank you again for having agreed
Don't thank
for
me
this.
until I'm done.
I'm extremely pleased and honored and stressed as well.
It's a little bit hard to reconstruct, but I would say sometime around 1970. So it was a long time ago, 45 years ago. I do remember when I played Mozart 503 in my senior year at Harvard, I did a cadenza which I had never written down, but whose outlines I had plotted. And so that was a kind of a way station towards removing the safety net. But it happened certainly in the early 70s, when I wasn't doing a great deal of concerto performance, but some loyal friends would invite me to solo with their orchestras, and they were in relatively small cities in America, and so it was a fairly reassuring kind of venue to try out highly dangerous things. I would say that what interests me the most are the details of a composer's persona from a musical standpoint. That is, elements that are rhythmic, that are melodic, that are harmonic, that are the DNA of the composer and can easily, for the most part, be recognized even by lay audiences. I mean, some of the more exotic ones perhaps less, but in general, those linguistic things. Now, when migrating back and forth between historic instruments and Steinways, I can say that, first of all, I am a Steinway artist and a very proud member of the Steinway family, and my wife and I, between us, own 4 Steinways. So we aren't exactly going away from that, and my wife, like me, also plays the panoply of period pianos. But when Malcolm Bilson introduced me to the world of period piano playing back in 1980, I don't think I imagined at that point how revelatory it was going to be for me to understand so much of the details of composers' writing and how those are directed at the particular acoustic and physical properties of historic instruments. You know, it becomes one case after another saying, so that's it, yes, okay. You know, things that might work on a Steinway perfectly well, but suddenly when you understand how quickly the sound dies away, or when you understand how the overtone mix is, or when you realize how the balance between the hands works, then the interesting question actually becomes, to what extent can these extraordinary discoveries, or at least they seemed extraordinary to me, can they be carried back to the world of the standard concert grand of today? And I think I can say that my exposure to historic instruments has transformed the way I play on Steinway. So I'm very, very grateful for the constant dialogue between these two families of instruments. I would certainly hope so. I don't, in general, engage in, shall we say, self-conscious display, either when playing or when lecturing. Some people have felt that I ham things up when I play, particularly when I'm directing from the keyboard, which I've done a great deal of here in the UK, and especially in London with the AAM and the OAE and so on. But there I would argue that nothing that I do is caused by anything except the emotions and the character that the music is conveying at that particular time. And when I was a professor at Harvard, ran performance practice seminars, one of which was 17th and 18th century music, and the other which was 19th and 20th century. And early on in my outings of this, a very talented tenor named Joel Dörfner came in with a cantata by Monteclair, and he prepared 2 performances of it. The first one was what we would perhaps call a standard performance, in which he stood with decorum and elegance and
Yes.
sang this cantata. And in the other, having done a good deal of research into the world of gesture and rhetoric of the time, he presented us with a fully fleshed out, with hands, face, with body motion, performance, which overwhelmed the audience. They felt in retrospect that the standard approach was woefully one-sided. So I think we're probably not used to having classical performers do that kind of thing. That most of the time we criticize grimaces or other involuntary motion that many instrumentalists or singers may have. And none of us can really guarantee that we don't do that. When I ran a performance class years ago at the State University of New York at Purchase, I would have all of the students come and perform and videotape them. And most of them were mortified when they saw the things they did. The clarinetist who taking the bell of the instrument up and down, and the violinist shifting feet from one way to another and so on, saying, "Oh my God, and would want to look away." But I think that there are vocabularies of gestures which are appropriate to the music and which reveal what the music is saying. As far as what I do when I lecture, first of all, almost none of my lectures are from prepared texts. So I improvise the lectures just the way I improvise cadenzas. And what I've discovered over the years is that the lectures certainly have a trajectory, some of which is intentional. But in particular, when I wind down a lecture, I get to a certain point, I have always found myself able to arrive at a way of ending the lecture which provides a sudden focus and a sense of closure that seems really fortuitous because I haven't planned it, but it just works. And I think this is just a question of spending so much time involved in communication, whether it's through musical tones or through words, that one interacts with an audience, whether conscious at some times and subconscious at other times, is difficult to predict. But I think it does happen, and it is something which I find very rewarding. Oh, I have no idea. I would be in terror because I could imagine that he would rip me to shreds for these puny attempts that I've made to finish some of his unfinished pieces, and probably say, how could you have gotten that so wrong? You know, how could you have misunderstood my intentions there? Or he might say, well, considering how badly everybody else has done, I suppose yours aren't the worst thing that one could imagine. But I don't know. I wouldn't know where to begin. In fact, I wouldn't want to ask him anything. I would just want to be around him and see him do what he does. There's a story I tell on this that's a bit tangential to this, but not entirely irrelevant, which is that in the Mozart year 2006, I was in St. Louis playing with the symphony, and I played the C minor concerto in the first half of the program, and in the second half is the Jupiter Symphony. And I was listening to the Jupiter Symphony. I always go out in the audience when I'm engaged as a soloist, because as a respect for the orchestra and the conductor, I like to go out and listen, not just put on my Mac and go home. And I was listening to the first movement of the Jupiter. This is a piece that I know very, very well. I could play the whole symphony on the piano because I know it. And they got to the second subject, one so these two little semitones going upwards, and of course that was nothing surprising because I knew that that's the way it went. But suddenly my brain did something unexpected. It suddenly recalled that the previous piece that Mozart had written for 41st Symphony was the 40th Symphony. The G minor Symphony was the piece that immediately preceded the Jupiter. It's K550 and the Jupiter is 551. Well, how does the second subject of the 40th Symphony go? It goes ba-da-dum. And I suddenly thought, oh my God. So 40 goes ba-da-dum, and 41 goes be-da-dum. I wonder about 39. I wonder about other places in the piece. And suddenly my mind was miles away from this evolving Jupiter Symphony performance, and I was scouring through the scores of these 3 last symphonies, and I realized to my amazement that those double semitones were everywhere. And then I thought to myself, now what is the likelihood that this is a coincidence? Well, with a composer like Mozart, the likelihood has got to be pretty close to 0, to nil. And so then, and this is where this connects to your question, I imagined going into a pub in Vienna after a performance of these 3 symphonies. And there was Mozart with his friends having punch and, enjoying himself and so on, and coming up to, oh, Mr. Mozart, I simply can't get over these 3 symphonies or anything else that you've written. They've changed my life. They speak to me. Tell me, these semitones in these symphonies, that was part of the grand plan, wasn't it? You really did that quite intentionally. And I wondered, now what would he say? And I thought, I think what he would say is, that is none of your bloody business. How I write my music is no concern of yours. What matters to me is, does my music make you weep? Does it make you laugh? Does it make you unfit to do anything for hours on end? Does it change how you look at life? That's what I want to know. And as for the rest, just keep the hell out. Now, I don't know if he would say that, because after all, he did teach composition and theory to his pupils. But I could imagine that he might just say that. And therefore, thinking that he might just say something like that, what on earth could I or should I ask him?
Yeah.